Shoot. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual lab tour of the 3-meter geodynamo experiment, which you can see behind me here and is housed at the University of Maryland College Park campus. My name is Heidi Myers, and I'm a geology geophysics graduate student, and I work with the team that does the 3-meter project in Daniel Lathrop's Nonlinear Dynamics Laboratory. And I'll be giving a little background information about the motivation for this project and some basic geology knowledge, why we do this, and then Sarah's going to show you around the lab. So to start out with, we should talk a little bit about Earth's magnetic field, because that is truly the inspiration and the reason why we do this project in the first place. So in order to do that, we should ask ourselves, what does the magnetosphere do for you? How do we know it's there? How does it work? And how do we study it? So to tackle this first question, what the magnetosphere does for you, what the magnetic field's presence does for you, is that it deflects solar wind. So it actually takes away the chance for these harmful high-energy particles to hit us from the sun. And if the magnetosphere wasn't there, those high-energy particles that come from the solar wind would actually strip away the ozone and let in really harmful UV radiation, which would be really, really devastating for life on Earth. So also the magnetosphere allows for electronics to function properly, and it allows for circumnavigation of the planet, so it was very important, especially for early explorers. And it allows for orientation and navigation of creatures with something called magnetoreception. So creatures that have this magnetoreceptive response actually use Earth's magnetic field as a way to orient themselves and to navigate across the planet. So there is some evidence that this also includes human beings, so we might need to care about the magnetic field's presence even on a personal human being level. So how do we know it's there? Well, firstly, the behavior of compasses is a really strong indication because the needles align with magnetic north, but also there's alignment of ferromagnetic minerals in rocks. So when oceanic crust is created, for example, there's a lot of material in there that actually responds to the ambient magnetic field and can lock in information about what the magnetic field behavior is at that time when it's being formed. So we see this record in the rock record of Earth's magnetic field behavior throughout geologic history as well, including times where the polarity of it, so where north and south are, actually flip. So we're able to see that in the rock record. And that's one of the reasons we know that the magnetic field for Earth has been persistent for a long time. So how does it work? So in order to talk about this, I need to introduce the concept of the geodynamo. So the geodynamo is in the name of the experiment for this lab, and it basically refers to the engine that creates Earth's magnetic field. So the basic idea with this is that Earth's core is solid, and the inner core is solid, and it's surrounded by this liquid outer core. So this inner core is made of highly metallic material. So it's predominantly iron and nickel. It's a solid metal ball, you can think of it that way, surrounded by still metallic material, but in a liquid form. And if we zoom in sort of on this outer core, inner core interface, you get this picture over to the right. So we have the solid inner core, the liquid outer core, and because Earth is spinning and there's this convection happening from this really hot material that's cooling off over time, it creates this really turbulent flow in that liquid outer core. And what's happening, because it's really high in metal content, that turbulent flow causes these electrons to spin off from the metals, which creates an electric current and thereby induces a magnetic field. So for those of you who have had a little bit of physics, that this is not a new concept, but yes, so this is how we create a magnetic field. So the TLDR here is that this spinning molten solid and liquid material at the core interacting together causes the magnetic field. So this brings up the question, well, how do we study it? We can't quite get to the core. So how do we know it's there? How do we figure out what the dynamics of it are enough to maybe forecast its behavior into the future? Well, there's two different approaches to that. So we can use models or we can use experiments to try and understand the geodynamo, to understand how its behavior not only was formed, but how it changes in time. So if we focus in on modeling, what that basically entails is building computer simulations using properties of metallic fluids. This whole field is called magnetohydrodynamics. So you see, even in the title of that, we have the magnetic part that has an influence. It's hydro, so we know we're dealing with liquids, and we want to study the dynamics of those two things interacting. And so simulations will try and replicate patterns that are seen in the rock record, so older material, as well as the human record of human beings writing down observations of the magnetic field. So of course that's going to be much, much younger. So the difficulty involved with making these models, one, they're quite complex, but two, there's a limited amount of data to use to even create the models in the first place. So that oceanic crust that I mentioned before that can lock in information about the magnetic field at the time of creation, the oldest of that crust is actually less than 200 million years old. The reason for that being that oceanic crust eventually actually subducts back into Earth's mantle. So we lose the record of what the magnetic field looked like at that period of time. So the oldest material we have is less than 200 million years old, which seems like a long time to have information, but when you consider that the Earth is on the order of 4.5 billion years old, this really actually isn't much information at all. And if we need really high quality data, which is what's needed for models, then we actually have less than 200 years. So we have this less granular, older data and only 200 years of high quality data to make the models with. So the other approach to try and understand these dynamics is actually to build experiments and see how those experiments behave and let those be an analog to Earth systems as a larger picture. So when we talk about experiments, then things like our lab come into play. So meet the 3-meter geodynamo system. So this is an artist's rendering of the system that you're going to have a tour of shortly. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what the experimental setup is, what the goals of the experiment are, and what the current status is. So looking at this setup, we have this 3-meter diameter stainless steel outer sphere. So what this is meant to replicate is that interface between the outer core, so this is like the edge of the outer core, and then the mantle would be sort of the free air outside. Then we have this 1-meter diameter inner sphere, also made of stainless steel, that's meant to replicate the inner core, so that solid core. Then in between those two large spheres, there's actually 12 tons of sodium metal that we heat up so that it's in liquid form when we're running experiments. And the reason why sodium was chosen is it's actually a pretty good conductor. And so it's a really appropriate choice to try and replicate the material that you would see at depth near Earth's core. So how this experiment runs is there's two different motor systems. One is attached to the axis of this inner sphere, so it allows for the inner sphere to spin. And then there's one attached to this outer sphere, which allows that to spin. So there's two different motor systems, which means that we can ultimately spin each one of the spheres independently of one another. And you might ask yourself why you would need to do that. Well, it turns out that Earth's core is actually moving at a different velocity than the rest of the Earth. So this is an effort to not only increase turbulence in the experiment itself, but also to replicate real-world conditions as an Earth system. So there's also these large magnets, electromagnets, surrounding, which is currently being used to help give sort of a seed magnetic field, and then the goal is to try and amplify those. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk a little bit about the goals of the experiment. What we really want to do in this lab is create our own mini geodynamo in order to understand Earth dynamics better. So by studying this system that we think is pretty close to how Earth systems are, we can then get an idea of how they behave in time, how they behave under different conditions, and ultimately the goal is to use this data to build sort of a magnetic field forecast. So this super important thing in our lives, this magnetosphere, we don't really have an understanding of why or when these polarity shifts that I mentioned earlier happen. And it would be really useful to know this information because that could drastically impact life on Earth. It could certainly impact the way our electronics function. And it would just be a really important piece of information for humans to have at their disposal to understand how our system is changing around us. So, the current status of the experiment. Well, experiments up to this point have been partially successful. So using these external electromagnets as sort of a starter kit, so a seed magnetic field, there has been some evidence that that magnetic field amplitude has grown. So that's part of the starting steps in making your own geodynamo. You want to take a seed magnetic field and make it grow. But the goal is to make it grow enough that it actually switches into dynamo action. And so we haven't achieved that quite yet. And the thinking is that while that sodium is spinning turbulently, it may not actually be spinning turbulently enough to cause the dynamo action. So it's chaotic, but we need some more chaos. So this sounds discouraging. You know, no, what now? What are we supposed to do with this experiment? But it's actually an incredibly exciting time for our laboratory because redesign efforts have been underway and are currently starting to happen to change the experiment structure in order to increase turbulence, so increase the chances of actually getting a dynamo. So let's talk a little bit about what that redesign plan looks like. So the idea is that we want to take this whole thing apart, change it a little bit, put it back together. That's sort of the TLDR. But the plan includes removing these motors. And you can't see it in this artist's rendering, but there's actually a suite of instruments and electronics that sit on top of this, this lid that track different changes in the experiment as we're running it. So we want to remove all of that, remove the lid, drain out these 12 tons of liquid sodium into a storage tank. And I should mention that sodium metal is actually quite volatile and it's dangerous to handle. So it can ignite, it can cause fires quite easily. And so it's a hazardous undertaking that we're doing. But we want to drain out all of that sodium, remove the inner sphere, and then the idea is that this inner sphere is actually going to get sort of a rough makeover. And when I say rough, I mean texturally rough. So our lab member, Ruben Rojas, has been working extensively on designing a setup that would allow for that inner sphere to increase extra turbulence when it's spun with respect to the surrounding liquid sodium. And so after a series of his experiments, there's one design that was settled upon, and so we're going to actually implement this on the large experiment. So there's going to be these textural changes made to this currently smooth inner sphere so that it's not so smooth anymore. And Sarah will show you a little bit more about that during the lab tour portion. But after we have made the adjustments to the inner sphere, the idea is to put the whole thing back together the way we found it so that we can start experiments again. And the ultimate goal here is to get the dynamo action. So what you'll see during the lab tour includes this massive storage tank and some of the progress in preparation in redesigning the experiment toward making our own little geodynamo in the lab. So I hope this gave a little bit of background information to you about where the experiment's coming from and what we're trying to do. And at this point, Sarah's going to take over and is going to show you the lab.
Thank you, Heidi. Here we go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cassie Burnett, and I'm a math grad student at the University of Maryland, also an organizer of Girls Talk Math. Today I'll be giving a tour of one of the labs in this building, the Institute for Research in Electronics and Applied Physics. So come on in and we'll begin. So welcome to the lab. First thing you see when you come in is this giant cube, which houses the experiment. We also have here a tank. It's empty right now, but eventually it'll be full of sodium, as well as a shed, which houses the controls for the experiment, as well as some graduate students. So if you come this way, kind of a tight squeeze in here, but I think we can all fit because it's just me. There we are. Sorry. So now we get a closer view of the experiment. So what this is the spherical 3-meter liquid sodium differentially rotating magnetohydrodynamic experiment. So let me break that down for us. So this is a spherical experiment, as you can see. It's 3 meters in diameter. And with this experiment, you see this large stainless steel shell, but there's also a smaller stainless steel shell inside, whose ratio and radii is comparable to that of Earth's outer core boundaries. So what we like to see is turbulence. That's our flavor of nonlinear dynamics. So what we do is we differentially rotate this outer shell and the inner shell. So for example, this outer shell can move around at a rate of 4 hertz. So that's 4 revolutions per second. So what that happens with that is we get predominantly fluid wrapping around the pole. But if it's moving that fast, this door will be closed and we'll all be safe in the shed. So, the fluid, yes, the fluid is sodium, which is heated up to hot, but not too hot, just so that it's liquid, about 115 degrees Celsius. And then it becomes viscous. Right now it's at a solid state, but when we heat it up, we pump hot oil through these rivets here, heating it up to like a liquid state. And when it's liquid, it's not very viscous. It's kind of like water in viscosity, but we never mix this with water. No, 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 no. If you mix sodium and water, you get fire. So yeah, so we have liquid sodium within, and the last thing to go over is the magnets. So we have a magnetic field that's produced by running current through these 2 electromagnets seen here. So we run current through that coils, and that produces a magnetic field that goes through the stainless steel shells and this liquid sodium within, as well as everything else. And then because of the interaction, or the fluid motion and the sodium wrapping around the pole, and because sodium is a conductive metal, that's why we chose it, the magnetic field lines become entrained in the liquid sodium, and the magnetic field also wraps around the pole. What we would like to see in the experiment is that we get magnetic field lines redirecting to go in this direction or in the same direction as the applied magnetic field. So our experiment's currently going under some upgrades in order to change the dynamics. So next thing I'll talk about is measurements. What measurements we can take. So we're gonna go to the top of the cube to check these out. So here we are. Now we have the inner and outer motor removed. Well, the outer motor was already removed, but the inner motor is removed as well. So you can kind of see we're missing pieces of the experiment to get it running. To get that whole thing to move around at 4 hertz, we need some pretty large motors on top. So the measurements we can take of these experiments right now are torque, of pressure, and also the magnetic field. Particularly, we measure the magnetic field on the surface of the 3-meter experiment, and of the radial component of the magnetic field, that is the part that goes from the center and outward. We also have one probe inside the experiment that measures the cylindrical, or 2 other components as well. So we're currently undergoing upgrades. We're going to drain this experiment, so we've got everything, most everything removed from the top, so that we can then drain the sodium from the top into that tank I pointed at below. What we'd like to do, as I mentioned before, is change some of the dynamics in the experiment. And to do that, Ruben Rojas and Artur Provolov have been working on creating an inner sphere that has we're calling baffles, or some kind of roughness to it, so we can redirect some of this fluid motion, hopefully in this direction. The last thing I wanted to talk about here is, nope, I think that's it. So, the last thing I want to talk about is another new measurement we are taking is something called, we're interested in taking, is something called acoustic velocimetry. Because I mentioned we have torque and pressure and magnetic field measurements, but we don't have a good picture yet of what the fluid is doing, what the velocity field inside is doing. So what we'd like to see then is using something called acoustic velocimetry to get some sort of picture of the velocity field within the experiment, which we'll first test on the hollow tank below. So now let's go downstairs and talk about those things. Okay, so the last part of the lab tour, I want to show you the inner motor that was removed. It's all the way over here. So it's actually an inner motor as well as a frame that is used to rotate the inner sphere of the experiment. The outer motor is seen here, laying down right there. And we removed this, not by hand, but by this crane that can carry up to 5 tons of weight. So we safely removed it and set it down so that we can clear the top of the experiment. I'm going to set this right here so I can talk a little. So what we have in the upcoming upgrades are, I mentioned before that we want to have more of this motion in the fluid of the experiment rather than this motion. So what Ruben Rojas and Artur Provolov have been doing is creating something called baffles. So adding some roughness to the inner sphere to redirect the dynamics from this direction to this direction. So here is one of the configurations that they were testing for the inner sphere in water. So this one wasn't the one that was chosen. The one that was chosen has more arrow shapes along the equator. But the purpose of these were to redirect that flow, and that was tested in a water experiment, so that's why I can't show it. The exact one here today, the exact model. Another thing that we are testing in the upcoming upgrades too is the idea of applying acoustic velocimetry to the experiment. So here, let me introduce the large sodium tank. So this tank is currently empty. And like the 3-meter vessel, it has kind of this piece right here, which will allow us to run hot oil through it so that we can heat solid sodium to liquid. But what we're testing right now on this empty tank, which is kind of easier geometrically to look at than the 3-meter experiment, is the possibility of adding acoustic velocimetry to the experiment. So what we have up here are some speakers as well as microphones, so that if you make a noise in the experiment and it's picked up by a speaker, then it will give us an idea of what is going on in the velocity field of the experiment, or in this case of just this tank. Right. So we have that, and we're prepping for upgrades right now. So a lot of prepping for upgrades is safety procedures. As I said, this experiment is a hazardous operation. Sodium metal cannot interact with water, or it will become flammable. It will catch on fire pretty easily. And it also can, if it catches on fire, can produce caustic smoke, which is bad to breathe. So a big part of preparing for this experiment and preparing for this upgrades is doing safety procedures and walking through the detailed plan of what we're going to do to remove the sodium from the experiment, to put it in this tank, and also to add the baffles to the inner sphere, as well as then put the sodium back into the tank and eventually spin again. So we're looking forward to that, being able to add baffles, and right now there's a bit extra PPE required because of the pandemic, so we all have face masks, but we are still making progress. So we're looking forward to adding those upgrades to the experiment, or draining the experiment, adding the upgrades, filling the experiment, and spinning again. So maybe next time you see us, we'll be spinning the experiment. All right. I'm going to stop share. Okay. Review. All right, everyone, that was our lab tour. So right now we're just going to open up things for questions. If you have questions for Heidi and I, we'd be happy to answer them. And I'm actually in the lab, so I'll move to a different location while you all think of some questions.
Can sometimes be quite inconvenient.
Sorry. So someone asked a question. Oh, we got a few of them. Everything's okay over here. I'm just knocking things over. So someone asked, how long did it take to build? So this was built, I think, in 2011, by at least the oldest papers I've seen, is when it started being built. But before, there were many prototypes of smaller experiments. And then we eventually made our way to the 3-meter experiment. And then there's also the first experiment is one that was in the French laboratory in Grenoble, France, which we call our sister.
So within the past year, I have.
And that was about this big. So they created one about the same time. So it took about, if it's 2011, it took about 9 years. And it's still being built. Another question asked is, I saw there are many gas tanks all around the room and most of them were highly flammable. What precautions do you take to ensure safety? So some of these gas tanks are to ensure safety. We have like right here, I think, is that a nitrogen tank? Yeah, it is a nitrogen.
Yes.
Thanks for confirming that. So we have a nitrogen tank here, which if we do have a sodium fire, we can't just put it out with water. So what we do is we put liquid nitrogen on it. And that's how we actually save the fire. I guess for small sodium fires, you can extinguish them with liquid nitrogen.
And actually, it's interesting to note too that that entire hangar where the experiment is being housed actually had to have the fire suppression system removed in order to be safer about this. So you'll notice there aren't any water sprinklers around the experiment, and that's just because water combined with sodium will lead to fire. So you're actually making the problem worse if you have what we consider to be traditional safety equipment.
Next question, do you heat the sodium in the experiment to the temperature of the core of the Earth? No, that would be very, very, very hot. With liquid sodium, it has for metals, it has a very low melting temperature. So we heat it just hot enough that it is at a liquid instead of a solid, like it would be at a room temperature. If we heat it too hot, it would actually catch on fire as well. So we heat it just about to 115 degrees Celsius for our experiments that we perform. Let's see, any more questions?
So we have another question asking, what do you do with the measurements?
What do we do with the measurements? All right, so good question. So part of what I do is I like to study, where should I start? So I like to study models of the experiment because you can use computers to give a pretty good picture of what the experiment's doing based on laws of physics, how water should behave and how magnetic fields should behave. But there's only so much computers are capable of doing. They can't hold so much information of what's going on. And for experiments where everything's moving around so fast and there's so many fine scales, as it ends up, the models have limits. So what we do with measurements is we try to fill in the pictures that were limited by what was going on in the models. And hopefully this will give us an idea what's going on the Earth, where we just don't have a lot of measurements with the actual Earth. Heidi could speak more about that.
Yes, actually, it would be essentially impossible to get direct measurements from the core. The farthest drilling experiments don't even come close to drilling into the mantle even. So the core is way off. So we use these experiments as a way to try and understand indirectly what's happening with the Earth. So we build the system that sort of acts the way that we think that Earth does and see if we can replicate the results that we see from the Earth record, from the rock record. And actually this ties into a follow-up question here. So how do you know the experiment is accurate if the sodium isn't the same temperature as the core of the Earth? So the sodium itself is actually acting as sort of an analog. So it's meant to be similar to the core of the Earth and the composition, but it's actually not a direct comparison. So what we do is we try and make these approximations, and we use that information to get an idea of what's happening on the Earth scale. So it's kind of like making a smaller version in the laboratory, and we then take those results and project them out to understand the larger system as a whole.
And I was told by someone in the lab, this is an empty nitrogen tank. So the reason it's hanging out there is because it's empty and it's going to be removed soon. So yeah. More questions, please. Let's see. Is there a way which you offset the margin of error? I think that's for you, Heidi.
So I'm not entirely sure I'm understanding the context here. The mathematical margin of error, or how do we account for some of the differences between the setup of the experiment and Earth maybe? And if that's the case, then we actually do sort of a combination. We have this experimental data, and then we have models as well. So this is sort of a combined multidisciplinary effort where you take the modeling data and you take the experimental data and you try and match them as close as possible to any of the evidence that we actually do have, which are sort of surface measurements. And as I mentioned in the intro video, sort of larger scale rock record. That's sort of the goal here and how we account for error.
So that kind of study of pairing the experiment with a model is called a validation study. So you can say, oh, this model, mathematical model is pretty good, but can we trust it? And then you have to compare it with something that's real, that you measure, that might have some sort of error associated with it. One of the things that I study is a technique that's used a lot in weather modeling called data assimilation, where you take models that can, mathematical models or computer models that can do pretty well, and you combine those with real measurements so that we can pull the models close to the truth and give us a fairly accurate, like 72-hour forecast. Yeah, 3 days is about as accurate. So I'm trying to do that here, applying the techniques where we can only measure things on the surface of the experiment and combining that with some computer models together to give us an idea of truth and hopefully reduce that margin of error. Yeah. Got another question. I don't know if I'll be able to answer this one. How much has the experiment cost so far and who is funding the project? Well, the National Science Foundation funds this project. As for the numbers, I don't know exactly, but.
Yeah, as you can imagine, this sort of undertaking is quite expensive, and we've actually had multiple smaller projects that were funded under the NSF. So for example, this current project is being funded under the NSF under its own budget. So there's been multiple phases to the experiment and multiple rounds of NSF funding associated with it.
All the things that are created here, like the tank, this isn't just a tank that's pulled off of a rail car. It's a specialized tank that was created just for holding and melting sodium. And this thing at the bottom, I forgot the name of it when we were doing the part, is called a dimple jacket. So that's like a specialized thing that allows hot oil to run through. So a lot of the pieces of the experiment, it adds up because they're, well, pretty much one of a kind. I mean, don't actually often look for a tank that holds that much liquid sodium. So that's a factor that comes into play. How did you tweak the shape of the inner core in order to get the motion you wanted? i.e., how did you come up with that arrow shape? Oh, this is probably a good question for Ruben. So he actually tried several different configurations, and he just, by looking at what was a water experiment, so an experiment that had a clear casing to it, rather than the solid metal casing where you can't see inside. He did a safer water experiment with a roughened inner sphere, and they used image analysis techniques to see if some of the motion, more of the motion was going this way than this way. So you can kind of tell by like little bubbles in the water where the motion is going and tracing those. So after doing a bunch of studies of that, he came to the conclusion that the straight with little arrows was the best way to go. Any more questions for us? Oh, more questions. Why did you pick sodium in particular? Well, a few reasons. It's a conductive metal. So the magnetic field will pass through it and also be, when it interacts with the fluid, it'll move along with the fluid. So that was one reason. Also, it's relatively light for a metal, so it won't be crushing the stainless steel shell of the experiment by filling it up. And it's probably cheaper than most metals that we can get, like arsenic and things like that would also be conductive, but just would be expensive in that, what's that, 20 tons?
12.
12 tons. 12 tons of liquid sodium that fills it. Oh, how did you start working here? Oh, that's a good question. So how did you start working here? So I started working here because, well, I was interested in fluid dynamics, and you know, it's kind of unusual for mathematicians to get into fluids, like actual experiment fluid dynamics, not just math fluid dynamics. But I find that part is really rewarding. So in my undergrad at UNC, there was a fluid dynamics lab for the applied math people. So when I came to Maryland, I looked for a fluid dynamics lab. I mean, I didn't expect this experiment, but it's kind of, yeah, I wanted to still be involved with the experiment, so that's how I got involved with the 3-meter experiment. What about you, Heidi?
So I actually am more interested in this experiment from the earth science perspective. So I did my undergraduate degree at the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, and my major there was in geophysics. And one of the things that started being interesting to me toward the end of my studies was thinking about why Earth has all of these polarity shifts. So why is it that at certain points in time, the North Pole is the South Pole and the South Pole is the North Pole? So what drives that and how can we understand it? So we can't really access, again, as we mentioned before, the dynamics directly. We can't go to the core and take samples and have a look at what's happening. So the modeling that's been done to try and replicate this was interesting. But then when I learned about this experiment and what it's doing, it just seemed ridiculously cool. And actually, I had no intention to go to graduate school. But as soon as I learned about this experiment, I applied. The only place I applied, I really wanted to work here, so I did. And here we are.
Fantastic. All right, so I think that's all the time we have for Q&A. If there's any last minute questions, you can always send us an email or send us a message. We'd love to talk about the experiment.